Hello. I want to talk a bit about this situation regarding Mohamed Morsi, the former Egyptian president, who died the day before yesterday, dramatically in a court in Cairo where he was on trial. So Morsi was 67 and the former leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. He was the first democratically elected Egyptian president, but a controversial figure because he was an Islamist. But the circumstances of his death that is raising a lot of questions because he apparently had been slumped over, according to witnesses, in his cage in the courtroom for 20 minutes. And the security guard's first response was to get relatives out of the courtroom. And there are allegations that his medical requests had been, that he hadn't been treated properly. Um, this is one of those situations where you sort of have a moral, I wouldn't say dilemma, but it's a moral test in a way because I'm someone who's very, very, very critical of pan-Islamism. Mohammed Morsi was an Islamist. He was head of a pretty vile organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, which Egypt and many other countries deem to be a terrorist organization. Um, but this situation is going to make Morsi look like a martyr, and there has to be an independent investigation. If it is true that this man slumped over for some 20 minutes without getting medical treatment, that's a disgrace, regardless of who the defendant is. Even Islamists have human rights. That is just a basic premise of democracy. Um, and just looking at the report here, the country's first democratically elected president, who was ousted in 2013, was buried hastily in Nazar City to the east of the capital, against his family wishes for a burial in his home government of Sharqiya. Only a handful of family members and lawyers were permitted to attend the burial, but were not given access to an autopsy report. Um, the Egyptian Attorney General's office denied the claims that he had not been given access to medication. Well, frankly, they would say that. I mean, Egypt's state media basically goes with what the Sisi regime says. This is one of those situations where you have to recognize that wrong is wrong, regardless of who it involves. And I happen to believe that basic human rights is for everyone, including Islamists. It's different if you have a situation of an imminent terrorist attack and the police need to kill, for example, a potential terrorist. I think that's a different circumstance. But if someone is on trial, regardless of who that person is, if they have a serious medical problem, I understand he suffered from diabetes, then it should be a basic human right to have access to treatment. um, Egypt, frankly, has a terrible human rights record. And the sad thing about this is that, other than Syria, I think Egypt is an example of how Arab winter has turned out. Egypt's not in a state of total civil war, but there is a bloody insurgency going on in Sinai. I happen to believe it is right that the Sisi government is taking a hard line against Islamists in Sinai, including ISIS. So, that's absolutely justified. But the point about Egypt is there's generally bad human rights, very little press freedom, very little rule of law. And extreme police brutality. I mean, this is a country with an appalling human rights record. One of the biggest recruiting tools for Islamists is indeed Arab dictators, like in this case Sisi, whose regime tortures suspected Islamists and mass incarcerates them. I believe Islamism is a scourge on this world, and I do believe there should be a hard line taken against Islamists. I believe that if found guilty of terrorist offences, they should serve hard time. Um, but there needs to be due process, and the current situation, the Egyptian press is largely controlled by the government. This is a dictatorship. I mean, Sisi is basically Mubarak part two. He's just another Mubarak. And that's the tragedy of Egypt, that young Egyptians, young secularists, moderates, when they overthrew Mubarak, they certainly didn't want an Islamist alternative. You know, they were understandably very concerned with the Morsi presidency. But I find it hard to believe that they genuinely want another Mubarak either. In fact, when I heard this news, former Egyptian president has died, I thought it was Mubarak because Mubarak's now in his 90s and his health has also been poor. So I thought it would be Mubarak. Morsi 67, so he's a good bit younger, was. This has to be independently investigated. If the Egyptian authorities have nothing to hide, they won't take any issue with that. They shouldn't be preventing an independent autopsy. So the reason why this is a problem is it's a vicious cycle because now Morsi becomes a martyr. There were demonstrations for him in Istanbul. He's become a martyr, and all it does is galvanize the Islamist cause, and that's a bad thing because Islamism is a scourge on this world. So the Sisi regime needs to show that yes, tackle Islamism. That's a good thing. You know, it's important for Egyptian secularists, very important. But by the same token, it cannot just repeat the brutalities and the human rights abuses of the Mubarak era, which is the very thing that led to the Egyptian revolution in the first place. So it just feels like Egypt has stepped back 10 years, and Sisi is just another Mubarak. It's very sad. Um, by the way, just once again to clarify, I'm no apologist for the Muslim Brotherhood. I do consider it a vile organization, and I'm sure that Morsi has blood on his hands, had blood on his hands. But regardless, if you martyrize someone, if you put a leader on trial and they collapse and you don't give them medical treatment, I mean, I don't buy the state's claims that he was given adequate medical. I just don't believe that because the witness statements suggest otherwise, and it's just not in the nature of the Sisi regime, knowing what we know about the torture that goes on in Egyptian prisons. Majid Nawaz, whom I have great respect for, and Ed Hussein have testified to suspected Islamists, even suspected Islamists, not proven Islamists, suspected Islamists being tortured in Egyptian jails. Now, torture is an abomination. And those of us who believe in human rights have to be consistent. So this has to be independently investigated. The danger here is that Morsi becomes a martyr. He already has, arguably, because people will say that they have effectively murdered him. They haven't murdered him, but that's how it will be perceived, and all it will do is galvanize Islamism in Egypt and create further security problems. So, unfortunately, that's what seems to be the scenario here if there isn't an independent investigation. But that isn't going to happen because this is a dictatorship. So it's a vicious cycle, and that's really sad. It's tragic.